Usually, when we think about a massive new movement taking over the world, like a political revolution or a brand new religion, we sort of expect a wrecking ball.
Right, yeah, a clean slate.
Exactly. The assumption is that you clear the lot, demolish the old foundations, and just build this shiny new skyscraper entirely from scratch. Because it's dramatic, and it makes for a very comforting historical narrative for you, the listener.
Oh, absolutely. We definitely gravitate toward those absolute beginnings. I mean, the idea of a complete rupture from the past is just a much easier story to tell than, well, the messy reality of how history actually works.
But when you look closely at the origins of modern Christianity and its rise through the ancient Roman Empire, that wrecking ball is it's completely missing.
It really is.
Yeah, instead of a demolition crew, the stack of historical texts and archaeological sources we are diving into today, it reveals this massive, centuries-long project of extreme cultural renovation.
Yeah, it's essentially the absolute definition of cultural recycling. I mean, the early church found itself operating in a vast, really deeply entrenched pagan world.
Right.
And to convert those masses, you can't just speak Latin or Greek. You have to speak the visual and philosophical languages that, already govern their daily lives.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that brings us to the core concept of today's deep dive. Scholars call it Interpretatio Christiana.
Right, the Christian interpretation.
Yeah, but the sources we have actually describe it as this engine of assimilation, which is such a cool phrase.
It is, yeah.
And the formula was basically, the ultimate goal was to erase pagan imagery, right?
Yeah.
But the method was brilliant. Pagan concepts go in, the theological machinery strips out the old meaning, and Christian concepts come out.
Yeah, they didn't just burn it all down. They reformatted the culture. It was this deliberate, really brilliant cultural synthesis.
Because you can't just hand people totally alien concepts and say, hey, forget thousands of years of your family's traditions.
Exactly. You have to use their existing cultural vocabulary to tell a brand new story.
Right. So to see how that engine actually functioned, we need to go back to the absolute beginning, like literally the beginning of the world, or at least the destruction of the first one.
The flood narratives.
Yes. The story of a great deluge is obviously foundational to Genesis, but the texts show it relies on a much, much older Mesopotamian blueprint, specifically the Epic of Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah, the structural overlap between Genesis and those older Sumerian texts is, it's impossible to ignore.
It's crazy similar.
It really is. You have a divine decision to wipe out humanity with a massive flood. One chosen man is warned, Napishtim or Atrahasis in the older versions, and Noah in Genesis.
Right.
He's told to build a massive vessel, bring the animals aboard, and just wait it out. And afterward, he sends out birds to find dry land.
Wait, even the birds are the same?
Oh, yeah. In Gilgamesh, it's a dove, a swallow, and a raven. In Genesis, it's a raven and a dove. And then once they hit dry land, the survivor immediately offers a sacrifice.
Okay, so the mechanical plot points are, identical.
Huh.
But where we see that engine of assimilation working is not in the what, it's in the why, right?
Exactly. The Hebrew authors took this widely known cultural memory and completely replaced its internal logic.
Because in the older Mesopotamian lore, the gods send the flood for a really kind of petty reason.
Yeah, humans are just too noisy.
Right. The gods literally can't get any sleep because humans are overpopulated and loud.
The motive is completely capricious, and the aftermath really highlights how limited those pagan gods were, because they rely on human sacrifices for food. So with humanity wiped out, the gods are starving.
Wow.
Yeah, the texts actually say that when the survivor roasts his sacrifice, the gods crowd around the smoke like flies.
Like starving flies. That's such a wild image, but it's like a rough draft of a movie script, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the Genesis authors come in, keep the set pieces, but entirely rewrite the theme.
This raises an important question, though, about how ancient people understood the world. Because in Genesis, the flood is reframed as a profound moral judgment on wickedness.
Right. God isn't swarming the sacrifice like a bug.
No, the sacrifice is accepted as the basis for a lasting moral covenant. They shared what historians call a cognitive environment. They used that familiar narrative template to communicate a radical new idea about the divine.
Okay, so they repurposed Mesopotamian myths to get a compelling moral narrative. But a good story isn't enough to conquer the Roman Empire.
Definitely not.
To stop being seen as just like an uneducated peasant cult and actually win over the ruling class, they needed intellectual armor. And to get that, they had to borrow the blueprint for heaven directly from Greek philosophy.
Right, the Hellenization of Christianity. As the faith spread, early church fathers like Clement of Alexandria realized they needed serious philosophical rigor, so they turned to Plato.
Let's talk about Plato's theory of forms, because it's essentially the framework they used.
Yeah.
Plato argued our physical world is just this imperfect shadow world, right?
Yeah.
And there's a separate eternal realm of perfect concepts.
The forms, yes.
It's almost like a 3D printer.
Yeah.
Like our world is just a flawed plastic print of a perfect digital file that exists somewhere else.
That's a great way to look at it. And Christians basically said, exactly, and that perfect digital file is heaven. They lean heavily into Plato's soul-body dualism.
The idea that the immortal soul is inherently better than the temporary physical body.
Right. But that creates a huge theological tension.
Yeah, because the ancient Hebrew tradition says the physical creation is inherently good. So if you adopt Plato's view that the physical world is just a shadow you need to escape, don't you accidentally demote the physical world?
Theologians fiercely debate that exact point today. It absolutely shifted the religion's focus heavily toward the ethereal and the afterlife.
But they felt they had to do it to survive.
They did. They viewed Greek philosophy as a providential tool, like a preparatory training to help educated Romans understand the gospel. And when they needed to explain the Trinity, they turned to Aristotle.
Right. The ultimate math problem. How is God three persons but one God?
To solve that, they used Aristotle's concept of ousia, which roughly translates to substance or essence. It gave them the vocabulary to separate what God is, the singular substance, from who God is, the three persons.
Which is wild. And they didn't just use Greek philosophy for theology, right? They use it for the actual Sunday service.
No, absolutely. In the pagan world, worship was largely outdoor blood sacrifices. Very chaotic, very action-oriented.
But the Christians moved it indoors.
Yes, and centered it around the spoken word. To do that, the Mass was actually conducted like Aristotle's rules of rhetoric. He dictated that a persuasive speech needs a strict logical flow, a beginning, middle, and end.
So the modern sermon is basically built on the framework of Greek sophists.
Completely. It transformed worship into a structured intellectual lecture.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because high philosophy works for the elites in Alexandria. But how do you project authority to the average person walking the streets of Rome?
Well, for that, you have to look at Emperor Constantine and the Roman state cults.
Yeah, specifically Sol Invictus, the cult of the unconquered sun. When Constantine legalized Christianity, the visual rebranding was just massive. Take the halo, the nimbus.
Right. Most people think the halo is an inherently Christian symbol.
But the sources trace the evolution of the nimbus back to Mesopotamia. It started as this concept called melamu.
Yes, a terrifying, radiant aura of divine power worn by the gods.
And then it gets passed along like a visual relay race. It goes to Persian Zoroastrianism as ex verina, this royal splendor.
Exactly. And by the time of the Greeks and Romans, that ancient divine radiance evolved into the specific visual of Apollo Helios, the sun god. He was depicted with this effulgent sunburst halo around his head,
Which the Roman emperors then started using in their own portraits to show they had ultimate authority.
So when Christianity becomes the state religion, artists take this ancient symbol of majesty from Melamu to ex verina to Apollo Helios and apply it directly to Jesus.
Creating the whole Christ in majesty image, where he looks suspiciously like a Roman emperor.
The psychology of Roman authority demanded it. You had to look the part. Which is why it's so striking that, until Constantine, the clergy basically dressed like common people.
Wait, really? No special robes or anything?
None. There was no distinct uniform at all.
But once they get that imperial sponsorship, I guess dressing like a commoner is a liability.
Exactly. So they adopted the ceremonial robes of secular Roman officials, the deep purple colors, which were actually protected by strict Roman sumptuary laws.
Oh, right. Only the elites could wear purple.
Right. And they even adopted the tonsure, that practice of shaving the top of the head from an old Roman ceremony. Plus the processional music, candles, incense, all imported straight from the imperial courts.
I mean, is that just a cynical power grab by Constantine?
It's easy to see it that way, but for the church, it was about survival and scale. They were becoming a universal public institution, so they used the only symbols of reverence the Roman populace understood.
They co-opted the state's visual language. But what about their actual, religious rivals? Because if you were a Roman soldier back then, you were probably worshiping Mithras.
Yes, Mithraism was a formidable rival mystery cult derived from Persian traditions. Mithras was associated with the sun, born from a rock, and their core ritual was a communal meal of bread and wine.
representing the blood of a sacrificed bull. I mean, the narrative parallels are obvious, but the visual overlap is where this engine of assimilation really flexes.
It is. Scholar A. Dumont calls it the creative sacrifice visual template.
Right. Let's talk about the geometry of that. In Mithraic sanctuaries, the central image is always Mithras sacrificing the bull, right?
The Tauroctony, yes. Mithras is dead center. And flanking him symmetrically are his two attendants, Coates and Coterpates. One holds a torch pointing up, signifying life or the rising sun. The other holds a torch pointing down, signifying death.
And early Christian artists just lifted this exact layout for the crucifixion.
They absolutely did. You have Christ in the center. Flanking him symmetrically are Mary and John. Or, even more directly, the two Roman soldiers, Longinus and Stephaton.
Oh, right. One has a spear pointing up, and the other has the sponge on a reed.
Perfectly echoing the raised and lowered torches of the Mithraic attendants.
It's the ancient equivalent of modern movie posters. Every Marvel movie poster has the exact same layout because that visual language just works on the human brain.
What's fascinating here is that modern scholars don't really view it as intentional, cynical plagiarism. The mystery cults all shared a common origin in the Hellenistic world. They spoke the same universal visual dialect.
So if you wanted to paint a cosmic, world-saving sacrifice, that three-figure layout was just how you did it.
Exactly. But managing theology in the cities is very different from managing the common folks out in the rural areas.
Yeah, you can't just decree from Rome that some farmer in Gaul has to abandon his local protective spirit. Nature abhors a vacuum.
Which brings us to Pope Gregory I in 601 CE. He wrote a letter to missionaries in Britain with a very pragmatic approach.
He told them not to destroy the pagan temples.
Right. Destroy the idols, yes, but purify the buildings with holy water and put Christian relics inside, because if the people see their traditional places of worship preserved, they'll keep coming.
And he also swapped out the sacrifices. Like, instead of sacrificing oxen to pagan gods, throw a feast for a Christian martyr.
Keep the barbecue, change the theology.
Which is exactly how we get the Christianization of local pagan deities. Changing local pagan deities into Catholic saints to fill that psychological void.
Yes, and the sources give us some great examples. In Greece, Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, transitions smoothly into Saint Demetrius, who just inherits her job as the patron of farming.
In the Celtic goddess Bridget. She was associated with spring and healing, and she transitioned seamlessly into Saint Bridget of Kildare.
Maintaining almost identical attributes and feast days.
They're essentially pagans in trench coats.
It really was just continuity for the common people. But my favorite example of this visual permanence is the evolution of the sacred horseman.
Oh, this is such a good one. So, in late antiquity, commoners relied heavily on apotropaic amulets to ward off demons, right?
Yes, and a massively popular visual on these amulets came from a Judeo-Christian magic text called the Testament of Solomon. The image showed King Solomon on horseback, spearing a female demon named Lilith, or Abizu.
So you have this mass-produced image of a holy warrior on a horse stabbing an evil creature. Everyone knows it means protection. But then the church decides to abandon the Testament of Solomon because it's too magical.
Right, but the people refused to give up the amulets. The visual was too deeply embedded. So once the sacred horseman visual was established, the image needed a new hero.
And apocryphal stories just rushed in to match the artwork.
Exactly. That is how we get the enduring legends of St. George and St. Christopher taking on the role of the serpent-spearing warrior.
They just recast the lead actor to fit the new theology, but kept the poster.
The ultimate engine of assimilation. Preserve the outward form to provide psychological safety, but inject it with approved Christian meaning.
Right. Which brings us to a sweeping conclusion here. When we look at all these sources, the roots of modern Christianity, it's not just a single tree that grew in a vacuum.
Not at all.
It's a massive tapestry. Sumeria, Greece, Sol Invictus, and Celtic lore make up the roots of modern Christianity.
And the defining takeaway is that they didn't so much as plagiarize, they built a bridge. By borrowing their images, heroes, and philosophies, they allowed the old religions to transcend into theirs.
They created a universal language. You keep the foundation, repurpose the rooms, but the people still feel like they're home.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? Well, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering thought to mull over. If ancient Christianity so successfully and so quietly baptized the secular and pagan elements of its day to survive, absorbing everything from Plato's heaven to Roman court fashion, what modern cultural or secular elements is religion quietly absorbing today to stay relevant?
Think about the technology, the corporate structures, the modern psychology that institutions use right now. If you removed every single borrowed influence from modern belief, what would actually be left? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the history around you